Imagine a faith so radical that women stood at its heart, preaching, leading, and even staying by Jesus' side when his closest male followers fled in fear. In the early days of Christianity, women weren't just supporters. They were apostles, deaconesses, prophets, and the unwavering backbone during Jesus' darkest hours. But here's the mystery. Why did women hold such prominent roles in some regions like Asia Minor and Syria, while facing restrictions in others like Rome? Join us on a journey into the hidden history of early Christian women, a story of courage, faith, and cultural clashes that will challenge everything you thought you knew about gender in the early church. Welcome to a discovery like never before in Christendom. Today, we're unraveling the question, why did early Christian women's leadership roles vary so widely across regions? From the bustling ports of Asia Minor to the desert churches of Syria and the imperial heart of Rome, we'll explore how cultural norms, biblical interpretations, and power struggles shaped women's roles. And we'll start with the women who stood by Jesus himself, loyal when the men ran. This is a story of resilience, diversity, and faith that reshapes our view of early Christianity. Let's begin at the very start, with Jesus' ministry. It's the 1st century, and Jesus is traveling through Galilee and Judea, preaching a message of love and equality. Unlike the rabbis of his time, who rarely taught women, Jesus welcomed them as disciples. Women like Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna followed him, supporting his ministry with their resources, Luke 8:1-3. These weren't just wealthy benefactors, they were active participants, learning at Jesus' feet alongside the 12. Take Mary Magdalene. She wasn't just a follower, she was a key disciple, often misunderstood in later traditions. The Gospels describe her as a woman from whom 7 demons had gone out, Luke 8:2. But there's no evidence she was a sinner or outcast. She was a devoted follower, and her presence was constant. Then there's Mary, the mother of Jesus, and other women like Mary of Bethany, who sat at Jesus' feet, a place reserved for disciples, Luke 10:39. In a world where women were often confined to the home, Jesus' inclusion of women was revolutionary. Now let's fast forward to the darkest moment, Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. When the soldiers came for Jesus in Gethsemane, the male disciples scattered. Peter, who swore he'd never abandon Jesus, denied him 3 times, Mark 14:66-72. But the women, they stayed. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all record women at the cross watching as Jesus suffered and died. Mark 15:40-41 names Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, among others, who had followed him and ministered to him in Galilee. While the men fled in fear, these women stood firm, witnessing the crucifixion and later discovering the empty tomb, John 20:1-18. Mary Magdalene, in fact, was the first to see the risen Jesus in John's Gospel, earning her the title Apostle to the Apostles in early tradition. This loyalty set a precedent. If women were trusted to stand by Jesus in his final moments and proclaim his resurrection, why wouldn't they lead in the early church? Their courage in Jerusalem laid the foundation for what we see in places like Asia Minor and Syria. Let's move to Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey and Syria, where women's leadership flourished in the early church. Take Phoebe, mentioned in Romans 16:1-2. Paul calls her a diakonos, a deacon, of the church in Syria, near Corinth. This wasn't a minor role. Diakonos meant minister, a term Paul used for himself. Phoebe likely delivered Paul's letter to the Romans, explaining his teachings, a role akin to preaching. Imagine that, a woman in the 1st century, entrusted with Paul's words, standing before a Roman congregation. Then there's Junia, called prominent among the apostles in Romans 16:7. Later scribes tried to change her name to Junias, a male name, but no such name exists in antiquity. Junia was a woman, and she was an apostle, a leader sent to spread the gospel. In Philippi, Lydia, a wealthy businesswoman, hosted a house church, Acts 16:14-15. These women weren't just helpers, they were evangelists and teachers, building the church from the ground up. Why here? Local cultures made a difference. In Asia Minor, women in pagan religions, like priestesses of Artemis in Ephesus, held public roles. This openness likely influenced Christian communities to accept women as deaconesses and prophetesses. In Syria, the Didascalia Apostolorum, a 3rd century church order, describes women deaconesses baptizing and instructing other women, roles too sensitive for men. Archaeological evidence, like inscriptions from Smyrna showing Jewish women as elders or synagogue mothers, suggests a tradition of female leadership that Christianity adopted. Even legendary figures like Thecla, from the apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla, reflect this reality. Thecla preached and baptized, inspiring women across Asia Minor. Whether her story is history or legend, it shows a world where women's leadership was not just possible, it was celebrated. Now let's cross to Rome, where women's roles were increasingly limited. Rome was the empire's heart, steeped in patriarchal traditions where men held public power. Early on, women like Phoebe and Priscilla, who co-led a house church with her husband Aquila, Romans 16:3-5, had influence. But as the church grew, restrictions tightened. Why? Roman culture expected women to be submissive, and the church began to reflect those norms. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, church councils cracked down. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE banned women from serving as presbyters. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 set a minimum age of 40 for deaconesses, limiting their roles to assisting women. This shift mirrored Rome's male-dominated hierarchy, as bishops and priests consolidated power. Yet, the women at the cross set a different example, one of steadfastness that Rome's church struggled to reconcile with its growing structure. Interpretations of Paul's letters also played a role. Passages like 1 Timothy 2:11-12, "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness," were used to silence women. Scholars now argue 1 Timothy wasn't written by Paul, but by a later, more conservative author. Paul's authentic letters, like Romans, praise women leaders, echoing the loyalty of the women at the cross. This tension between radical equality and patriarchal pushback shaped Rome's restrictions. Still, women's influence persisted in Rome. 4th century sarcophagi show women teaching, and rare inscriptions mention female presbyters or bishops. But as the church aligned with Roman power, women's roles faded, unlike the bold legacy of those who stood by Jesus. What drove these regional differences? Power dynamics. Early Christianity was a network of house churches, often led by women like Lydia or Nympha, Colossians 4:15, who had resources and social clout. The women at the cross inspired this model, loyal, active, and central to the faith. But as Christianity grew, it needed structure. In Rome, bishops modeled their authority on imperial systems, sidelining women to appear respectable to elites. In Asia Minor and Syria, house churches lingered, giving women space to lead. The Didascalia Apostolorum describes ordained deaconesses, echoing the women who ministered to Jesus. But in Rome, church orders began restricting widows and deaconesses, demanding silence, a far cry from the women who proclaimed the resurrection. Even Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor in 112 CE, noted women's influence, interrogating 2 slave women called ministrae, deacons, in Bithynia. Their leadership was undeniable, but Rome's hierarchy slowly erased it. The legacy of early Christian women is profound. From the women who stood by Jesus at the cross to leaders like Phoebe and Junia, they showed that faith transcends gender. In Asia Minor and Syria, their roles flourished. In Rome, they faced limits. Yet their courage, seen in Mary Magdalene's witness to the resurrection, challenges modern assumptions. Today, some denominations embrace women pastors, reflecting Asia Minor's openness, while others, like the Catholic Church, hold to Rome's restrictions. These women weren't just footnotes, they were pillars of the faith. Their story reveals a diverse early church shaped by culture, scripture, and power struggles. The women at the cross, unwavering when others fled, set a standard that echoes through history. From the women who stood by Jesus to the deaconesses of Syria, early Christian women were unstoppable. Their story is a hidden gem, sparkling with courage and complexity. Want to dive deeper? Check the resources in the description, share this video, and tell us in the comments what inspires you about these women. Subscribe for more untold stories, and let's keep uncovering the truth together.